Welcome to the first of 3 videos that I'm doing on Dark Souls 2. This one will be focused on the strengths of the series and what changes were brought by the sequel. The second video will be a run through of the entire game looking at level design and boss battles. The third video will be a continuation of that, looking more in depth at the DLC released after the base game. Anyone should be able to watch and understand this series, but I highly recommend that you play the games first, both so you can better follow what I'm saying, and so that they're not spoiled for you. These videos will not be looking at anything to do with story. Spoiler warnings still apply for gameplay, surprises for boss battles especially. Finally, you may want to watch my Dark Souls 1 critique before watching this series. Matthew Matos's video on Dark Souls 2 is also highly relevant, although it's overwhelmingly likely that you've already watched it if you are interested enough to find this series. The 3 core pillars of gameplay in Dark Souls 1 are as follows. You start off at a bonfire and are given an area to explore. This is functionally a checkpoint at the start of a level, and you are sent back here if you die. You explore the area for hidden items and open shortcuts, either by kicking down ladders or unlocking doors or finding clever ways to bypass obstacles in the level. The larger world is linked in the same way, with unlockable and occasionally hidden paths. The scale of each level feels about right for it to be an actual place, and its relation to the rest of the world also feels solid. You are exploring chunks that have been split apart into levels by the bonfire system. While doing all of this exploration, you are fighting enemies. Some are undead humans like you, others are monsters. Compared to other action games, fighting in Dark Souls is quite slow. Every action you make has some sort of ramp up to it, but the same also goes for your enemies. Swinging a sword is an instant, and so there's time to process what's happening. The results of each action are also drastic. It only takes a few hits to kill you, and mostly a few hits to kill the enemies you're fighting. Combat will have its own section in a little bit, but for now let's leave it at that. Slower, more methodical battles that are almost always 1 versus 1. After fully exploring an area, you will come to a fog door that usually signifies that a boss is on the other side. These battles are against a much more powerful opponent than the ones you fight in the surrounding area. They often have several different moves or more complicated attack patterns. These fights are meant to be extremely challenging, and for the most part, they usually are, especially if it's your first time fighting the boss. All 3 of these gameplay pillars feed into each other when you're trying to overcome the area. The boss is the final hurdle, and if it kills you, you are sent back to the bonfire and have to fight your way back there. So by fully exploring the level, you can often open shortcuts that make it so you can get back to the boss faster to try again, or you might even discover a hidden bonfire closer to the fog door that makes it even easier. In combat, you can get better at fighting the enemies in each level, to the point that you can become so good that they don't pose any challenge to you. Once again, this means that you have a smoother time getting to the boss to try again. On top of all this is resource management. This would be a subcategory of Dark Souls gameplay that affects all of it. Specifically, healing resources tie intrinsically into exploration, combat, and bosses. The Estus Flask is your primary source of healing in Dark Souls 1. You have limited charges, and the only way to refill them is to return to the bonfire and rest. But this makes all the enemies in the level respawn in the exact same way as if you had just died and were sent back to the bonfire. This is the best mechanic in the entire series as far as I'm concerned, because it brings everything together. When you first start to explore an area, your flask charges dictate how far you can get. You're new and will make many mistakes, and that's what those charges represent. How many mistakes you're allowed to make before you run the risk of being kicked back to the bonfire. Then you get better and you've explored the whole area, but not without needing to chug a few charges. Charges that are vitally important for beating the boss for the first time. So now playing well isn't about being able to fully clear the area, but to make it to the fog door while making so few mistakes that you have healing charges to use while fighting that boss. This creates moments of so much tension. Do you risk pushing forward with your final charge? Are there any enemies you missed that might attack you if you try to get back to the bonfire yourself? Did you play well enough for it to be worth it to try your luck with the boss? For each area, this provides you tangible proof that you're getting better. Then, when you've beaten the game, you're shown even more how much better you've gotten when you start to be able to clear so many levels without really needing to chug some Estus, or ever think about turning back at all. It's my opinion that everything else in the Soul series are added extras put on top of this foundation. You could take them all away, and the game would still be pretty good with just these 3 core features in the Estus Flask. Of course, the extras push the game from good to brilliant, but it's important to know that this is what I consider to be the heart of the series before moving onward, because Dark Souls 2 changes all of it. Combat in Dark Souls only really works because damage numbers are so high. If you've played the game, think about how bad even early areas like Undead Parish would be if it took 30 hits to kill you instead of a handful. You could ignore pretty much all incoming damage and hack and slash away. This may seem like a yeah, well duh moment, but many games have this problem. It's not about difficulty at this point, but making combat have any sort of stakes or tension. I also think that other games could learn a lot by how Dark Souls handles this. When you increase the difficulty in most games, it usually means enemy health going up and their damage only slightly increasing. I wonder how many games could benefit from making enemies easier to kill with higher difficulty settings, but also making you more fragile at the same time. Skyrim might be improved by that, I'm not sure. So from here we can see that certain things have to be true about combat for this extreme take on damage to work. Put simply, if it only takes 3 hits to kill you, then those 3 hits need to be avoidable in some way. Dark Souls has a reputation for being very difficult, but also being fair. The line most often quoted about that is, whenever you die, it's your own fault. 95 times out of 100, this is true in Dark Souls 1, and it directly relates to what I said earlier about combat being slow. The swing time of attacks for both you and enemies allows you to process everything that's happening. All damage needs to hold true to these two qualities, predictable and preventable. The player is given many tools to make this happen and is encouraged to learn the attack patterns of enemies and bosses. That's almost always how a player will overcome the boss of any area. They will learn how the boss damages them, resulting in that damage becoming predictable. Once they can predict it, it becomes preventable based on player skill. Skill is also measured by how quickly someone can learn these patterns and then use the tools available to avoid that damage. Our old buddy the Estus Flask is also included here, because if the charges put a limited number on how many mistakes we can make, then those mistakes better be the fault of the player and not be unavoidable. It's why the fall into Gravelord Nito's boss room annoys me. It's not a big deal, but it grates against the rest of the game. You also need to deal damage back against opponents, and this is where the high amount of variety in combat really shines in the series. We'll limit equipment for now. Our example has a standard shield, a longsword, and some medium armor. This is pretty much an average loadout for a character in the game. Even here, we have a lot of options when it comes to reacting to enemy moves. Let's start with defense. An enemy begins an attack, and our reflexes are tested in two ways: to notice that the attack is happening, and then deciding what we want to do about it. We have three choices, each with their own level of risk and reward. On the low end, we can raise our shield and block the attack. When the opponent strikes our shield, we are momentarily locked in place as our character braces against the strike to withstand it. This also costs stamina, which limits our ability to strike back. The shield is very safe because it only requires the player to hold down a button to keep it raised, but makes it so you have to wait longer for an opening to retaliate, especially if your opponent launches into a multi-strike combo. In the middle, we can move our character to avoid the attack. You can roll, once again at a cost of stamina, but are not locked in place and can resume moving. With heavier enemies, the stamina cost is usually far lower than if you had blocked with a shield. This requires more timing on the player's part to roll at the correct moment and not get hit. Alternatively, the safer option would be to roll away from enemies. This makes counterattacking difficult, but you're given a broader window to execute the roll. Finally, if you're familiar with the enemy's moveset, rolling is not always necessary and you can simply shift away on your feet and then go back into attack. The highest risk option is parrying. You need to know the precise timing to bash with your shield in order to deflect your opponent's attack. This staggers them so you can perform a very high damage attack. These are usually scripted animations that look pretty good as an additional reward for you pulling this off. By the time your opponent recovers, you will have regained any stamina you spent, making this successful parry functionally free for the rest of the battle. You can make a similar list for offensive options. Light attacks are the quickest you can do and cost the least stamina, but also deal the least damage. There's less risk involved since your character will be locked into their swing animation for a short time. The middle option is the heavy attack, which has a significantly higher swing time but deals more damage. It's usually best if one heavy attack will kill an enemy where it would take two light attacks otherwise. At the top would be the forward lunge, which has such a long commitment for swing time and recovery that you're pretty much guaranteed to take damage if you miss with it. Certain players will favor certain options from this list. Some might even build their entire character around it. They'll wear light armor so they can move quickly to avoid attacks and have faster roll animations. Or they'll find the heaviest shield in the game that has the least amount of stamina loss when you successfully block a hit. Different weapons all have their own movesets, so there's the option to really commit to a weapon type and learn how it works, both with one-handed and two-handed. For instance, the longsword has a forward thrust that the broadsword doesn't. This ties into adding depth to learning how to use light, heavy, and lunge attacks. But there's even more to combat because of parry timings and using invincibility frames to dodge through an attack. For those unfamiliar, an invincibility frame is when your character is immune to all damage for a frame of an animation. For a roll, this means that even if the enemy hits your character model, you still do not take any damage. It's like another version of parrying since you need precise timing to use these frames to avoid an attack. Even blocking has something for players to master because of how stamina works in the game. I don't want to rag on Skyrim too much, but both it and Dark Souls are supposedly in the same action role-playing genre, and both have a stamina bar. In Skyrim, it functions exactly like mana for physical attacks. You can use it up and then there's a long recharge time where you have to run away or you can just keep attacking inefficiently with low stamina. In Dark Souls, it refills very quickly but ties into both offense and defense. It creates a flow in combat where you can spend your stamina on a few decisions and then have to wait for a second or two before it refills. Holding up your shield makes the bar refill much slower, so the player can learn the timings between enemy swings so they can lower their shield to regain stamina faster before raising it again. It's for all these reasons that my opinion on the combat in Dark Souls is so high. It doesn't have the deep combo systems and stringing together of moves like in other great action games, but the weight of each decision and how important they are makes clearing through large chunks of the game without ever messing up a really rewarding experience. Unfortunately, there is one exception that I didn't mention. Most enemies are susceptible to circle strafing and backstabbing. This is usually something that takes new players a while to figure out because it requires confidence on their part to getting close to opponents and prevent damage while getting behind them. Learning when to raise and lower your shield can be essential here. Combat is close to broken when you do this. Enemies simply don't have the tools to deal with it. Most can't turn around quickly and their attacks don't lock on, so you can avoid them if you keep moving. Fortunately, most bosses are immune to this. You can still do the strafing thing, but you can't backstab them for insane damage. The previous sections were important in setting up the standard of the series so we can see how Dark Souls 2 changes it. Try to keep what I've said in mind, even if you already disagree with me, since then at least you can understand how I reach my conclusions. First off, I want to talk about the reception of the game upon release. A quick visit to Metacritic shows that professional reviewers raved over this game. Now, much later, opinions are mixed. This is understandable since deadlines need to be met for the game's release, but it wasn't just reviewers on the big game sites that were quick with judgment. Many in gaming communities and on YouTube heaped mountains of praise onto Dark Souls 2 and can now be found, if you look hard enough, pouring just as much criticism on it today. I think this is hilarious, but also understandable and forgivable. If I had been making videos back then, I might have been one of them. The way that Dark Souls 2 deviates from the high standards set in Dark Souls 1 can be surprisingly difficult to pinpoint. It's why I just spent so much time laying down the reasons that I like the series so much. People's perception of the problems in the game grew slowly, and I think it's fair to say that the video released by Methodical was the tipping point for when many Dark Souls fans realized that something was wrong with the sequel. Dark Souls 2 sold just over 1 million copies in March of 2014, its first month since release. It likely sold many more when it was released on PC a little after that. Matthew Matosis released his critique a few weeks later and it has gotten over 500,000 views since then. People who actually participate in online discussions and the like end up being a surprisingly small percentage of those who have played the game or watched the movie, etc. Of course, people may have watched the video more than once or love his channel and watched without playing the game, but I still think it's fair to say that the exposure this video received is a significant number of people who played the game and discuss it with others. Let's go back to Metacritic. The user score is a fair bit lower than the other one. This isn't unusual, but even looking at Dark Souls 1 we can see that the difference is a bit wider. Most people who talk about the game will say that Dark Souls 2 is the worst in the series. Some will maintain that it's still a great game, but far weaker than what came before it. My intention with this video is to try to demonstrate how these two games differ, and to also argue that the gap in quality between the two of them isn't as great as most tend to believe. Since I just spent so much time addressing how the different systems in Dark Souls are all intertwined, it's difficult for me to find a place to start. My best guess now is where the games differ the most, and where the largest drop in quality can be found: exploration and level design. Gone are the layered areas that loop into themselves. Shortcuts are very rare, and in cases where they could have been used, have been replaced by extra bonfires instead. This next point is hard for me to know for certain because I played the game already experienced with the series, but there was never a single moment in the base game that I felt relief when I finally made it to a new bonfire. Exploration is now rewarded with hidden items or optional areas, but with only a few rare exceptions, these never feed into the main path through the level and don't help shorten the distance to reach the boss. What is arguably worse than all of this is the same quality was stripped away from the larger world and the way areas were interconnected in the original. Instead of giving you a tight cluster of intertwined areas for you to explore at the start, you are presented with 5 divergent paths. Some of these are blocked off until you progress far enough in other paths, but once you're familiar with the game, these can be easily bypassed. This is a shame because opening up paths between levels made for some of the best moments in Dark Souls 1 and could leave you with a feeling of awe over how everything fit together. That sense of discovery and then rediscovery is often said to be the reason many fell in love with the game, and this is wholly absent in the sequel. Secondly, these 5 linear paths should provide options for how players want to progress, but because they're all made available at roughly the same time, they all end up feeling just as roughly equal in difficulty. Whichever path you take last may end up being the easiest of them all. This shatters the sense of progress through more difficult levels for the first half of the game. Halfway through the original game, you were given the Lord Vessel and granted the ability to warp between certain bonfires. In Dark Souls 2, you have this ability right from the start and can teleport between every bonfire. Some people dislike this, but to me it highly depends on how it got into the game to begin with. This is sort of like a chicken or the egg of Dark Souls development. Because if the decision to allow warping from the start led to these disjointed levels, then it was the worst decision that the developers made in the entire game. If the disjointed paths were thought up first, however, then being able to warp from the start is a good thing because this sure isn't a world that I want to waste any time wandering through. You might be thinking that this all sounds terrible. Whether you are a fan of the larger connected world, or the shortcuts and discovering paths within each level, it's clear that this is a huge downgrade from the first Dark Souls. So then why did I say that I want to argue that the gap in quality between these titles isn't so large? I want to propose that this degeneration actually began in Dark Souls 1. The approximate point that the change happens is, funnily enough, after acquiring the Lord Vessel. It makes me think that it was the inclusion of the teleport that resulted in level design that was so poor. After Sen's Fortress, there's a clear shift away from both layered levels and interconnectedness. Take the following description. There are a few detours for extra items, but to reach the boss you follow a long, straightforward path from the bonfire with no shortcuts to unlock. Am I talking about the Undead Crypt, or Shrine of Amana, or Tomb of Giants, Chasm of the Abyss, Lost Izalith, Sinner's Rise, Crystal Caves? Excluding the DLC, the really well-designed levels in Dark Souls 1 are the early ones. Even Anor Londo could have done this far better, with Painted World being the best example of what it could have been. The same can be said for Dark Souls 2, which is one of the reasons why I think it's forgivable that so many people changed their opinion on the game. The first level, Forest of Fallen Giants, loops into itself and has 2 major shortcuts for the player to find. Shortly after that, Lost Bastille has lots of hidden extras and layered paths. You can even skip the first boss in this area outright. But after that, there are a handful of shortcuts here and there that don't really mean much. Usually the game leads you somewhere else to get a key or flip a switch to open the second path closer to the bonfire. This doesn't feel so much like a shortcut as it is just completing a task on the level and, in the cases of Looking Glass Knight and Velstadt, have long corridors crammed with enemies to eat away at your time. Playing the game again for the video, I was struck by how the tutorial area also adheres to this sort of level design. In the original, you went around the asylum a handful of times, climbing higher with each loop until you faced the boss in the central room. There was a door to unlock, and the drop-down was another way of entering that room. In Dark Souls 2, you have a long straight path to the end of the area, but with a bunch of offshoots you can follow for extras that always end up leading you back to the main path, but they never cross over with each other. It's like a beginner version of the final areas after the Lord Vessel. It makes me wonder if the change in level design was intentional, and what possible reasons they could have had for doing so. Maybe they wanted to focus more on combat. A long time ago, first-person shooters tasked players with navigating levels full of enemies that would shoot projectiles that you could avoid in some way. Much of the damage was preventable, and there were health packs spaced around each level, often hidden away to reward exploration. Difficulty in the game was directly related to the player's ability to kill enemies while taking little enough damage to not be screwed before finding the next health pack. A balance could be carefully constructed because the developers knew they could expect the player to be able to avoid most damage if they played well enough. Fast forward a little bit and you can see some changes. Shooters are becoming more serious, and with a sharp focus on World War II as a potential setting, enemies have something close to firearms that mimic reality. Both Half-Life 1 and 2 still use health packs and armor to replenish player defenses after getting through an area, or they'll place them in a combat zone so you can run to them in the middle of a fight. The entire game needs to be built around providing players enough of these resources so they have a chance to make it through each encounter with enemies. This can sometimes result in an overabundance of these healing items. What surprised me on a recent playthrough of Half-Life 2 was how little combat there is against enemies with actual guns. Give the game another run if you'd like to see what I mean. Even the first level against Combine underlings is full of pauses for puzzles or fighting the flying manhacks, zombies, or long vehicle sections. These are easier to balance because you can expect the player to avoid damage. You can't reasonably expect them to dodge hit scan bullets. It's around this time that a change was in its adolescence in first-person shooters. Regenerating health was becoming the norm, coupled with cover-based mechanics, and people have been divided on it ever since. The theory here is sound: give the ability to control incoming damage back to the player. Instead of long gauntlet levels of alternating challenges and healing, the combat has been shrunk down to be all about the short term. Managing your health in a firefight before knowing that you need to hide and wait to regen your life, or shields in the case of Halo or Bioshock Infinite. This allows developers to create gunfights that feel more exciting in a different way, since you can have firearms act realistically and can be more flexible with designing enemy groups, since you don't have to worry about the damage they can deal before the player should need a health pack. That being said, not every game does this well, and certain playstyles can end up cheesing through entire games by abusing this mechanic. Not to mention that, with cover, it can make a lot of games feel similar to each other, but to say that this is outright worse than the old system of dodging enemy fire isn't something that I can agree with. I think that both systems have their merits. Fallout 4 is the most recent shooter that I played, and it has its own minor twist on this setup by making regenerating health cost resources and have it be triggered by the player. You have to choose the time to use a stim pack, which temporarily interrupts your ability to fire, and then your life starts to climb. It was very strange to realize that the system closely resembles Dark Souls 2. Because that's the biggest change the combat has. It's made the jump from always avoidable damage and managing healing resources over an entire level, to focusing mostly on the short-term moments in each individual fight and having you heal continually. I played Dark Souls 2 on release day after intentionally avoiding any information on the game that was being teased online. I played it on a PlayStation 3 and then got it again later for PC when it was cheap on a Steam sale. Going in blind like I did, there was a moment I had that I wonder if other people who had played Dark Souls 1 also experienced. It was when I first noticed the life gems in my inventory and tried one out. I didn't have an Estus Flask yet, so I just assumed that they were a supplementation for that until I was given one. When I arrived at Majula, I was given the flask and then found a shard hidden in the well. After upgrading the flask, I once again figured that the gems were some sort of helping hand to be used in emergencies since the Estus Flask had so few charges. I honestly thought that these life gems must have been some of the rarest items in the game since their effect was so powerful. As you can guess, discovering that you can buy them for next to nothing shortly into the game was a bit of a surprise. I ignored them my first playthrough and instead focused on using the Estus Flask in the same way that it functioned in Dark Souls 1. I didn't use any life gems at all, which made Smelter Demon really frustrating, but we'll get to that in the next video. The inclusion of life gems destroys the careful balance that the levels needed to maintain with your Estus charges. This change feeds into a lot of other changes, so try to bear with me in this section because I think it's going to be difficult for me to pull this all together. We have another chicken or egg scenario here because enemies in Dark Souls 2 are handled very differently than in the original. Specifically, the amount of times that you have to deal with multiple enemies at once and how these enemies can move, how they react to circle strafing, and how their attacks can track you. Were these changes made and then life gems were added to make them fair? Or were life gems added first and then these changes to combat were made because now players have access to effectively infinite life regen? To understand all this, I think it's important to acknowledge that Dark Souls 2 is a sequel. Yeah, well duh, I know, but listen, a sequel has to act as an open doorway to newcomers but also appease fans of the series. The solution that I see for expanding on the difficulty of the first game would be an intense focus on the healing resources and stretch that over much larger, much more complex areas that have lots of one-on-one battles to test the player's ability to get through it all. This would be the only way to recapture that feeling of oh thank dog when you finally get to the next bonfire, and could incorporate a lot of shortcuts to have progress through these levels. This seems so obvious to me that I have to think it was a deliberate decision not to do this, especially considering that they kind of went on to do it with the DLC for this game. Instead, they shifted how the game is difficult to be more about individual combat encounters rather than a chain of them throughout a level. Of course, experienced players can still get through the game like it's just more of Dark Souls 1, but the prevalence of enemies that come at you in groups still change things. Looking at it another way, the developers also needed to address how easy the game could be if every fight was a single, lone enemy that you could circle strafe around and then wipe out with easily timed attacks or backstabs. This ruins any semblance of challenge built for going through all the enemies in a level, and pretty much everyone who beat Dark Souls 1 is going to know how to do this. Let's go back to the first game for a minute. When I made my critique, I weighed heavily on the negative side whenever the game had me fighting more than one enemy. My reasons for this still hold true, but I don't think I explained them as well as I could have. One-on-one, your options for avoiding damage are the same as I went over earlier. You can either block, dodge, or parry. You use these techniques to either wait or create an opening for yourself to counterattack. When there are two enemies, any opening that you wait for or earn for yourself has the potential to be ruined by this second enemy. Swing timers for both opponents can become unsynchronized, meaning that you can end up in a situation where there is literally no correct time to attack without taking damage. If the enemies are capable of hard-hitting attacks, this can lead to you running out of stamina when you try to block, or being caught by a second attack when you roll away from the first. Your best option is to avoid their attacks completely. Don't block or dodge, and instead run away from them. Don't use the lock-on mechanic, and utilize the freer range of movement you have to bait out your opponent's attack combo so that they're both vulnerable at the same time. This is the only way you can reliably deal damage to multiple enemies without receiving damage yourself. It's important to note that you could try to rush them down instead and decide that taking some damage is worth it to end the fight faster. I don't think this fits in properly with the rest of the game, however, for the reasons about limited healing that I went into earlier. It's also very easy to get hit and then locked into a combo for multiples, taking you from full health to dead. Dark Souls 2 is being built around fighting multiple enemies. It happens so much that it's flat out undeniable that the game wants you to learn how to deal with this scenario. Unfortunately, many players seem to think that this means using cheap tactics with ranged weapons, or by exploiting the game's AI with getting enemies stuck on doors, or luring them far enough away from their starting position that they reset and let you get some free hits in. What the game expects instead is something like this. These are two enemies in the very first area. You don't use the lock and instead change your tactics to weave in and around them both. You coax out attacks and then dart in to deal damage in whatever opening that you can find. This can be difficult, but you're outnumbered. It's meant to be challenging, and as far as numbers go, it is the literal definition of unfair. After playing the game so much and finally realizing what it wanted from me, I thoroughly enjoy this combat just as much as the one-on-one duels in the rest of the game. It can be thrilling, but it's not without its problems. Namely, sometimes you're just going to get slammed out of nowhere, and in Dark Souls 1, that's unacceptable. To answer my own question earlier, I think that this focus on multiples in combat was decided first. Then, through playing the game, it was discovered that some form of regenerating health was needed to balance it. Players can't be expected to execute everything flawlessly, and the chaos of dealing with several foes at once is far above the predictability and preventability of dueling one enemy. Then there are attacks that lock on in order to deal with circle strafing that can also end up feeling unfair and cheap. I disagree with their implementation, but in theory these are necessary, but the game needs to adapt for it to still be okay. Finally, areas tend to be a lot more open. This gives you more room to maneuver when fighting multiples and also a higher chance of being able to dodge ranged enemies. There aren't as many narrow corridors as there are in the first game, which helps alleviate the two big gripes I had with it. That enemies can attack through walls but you can't, and that enemies can harmlessly attack and reach through each other to hit you if they're all in the line. These are still in Dark Souls 2, but the more open combat arenas make it happen less. Even understanding these changes, I'm still torn on them. Having to decide when to use Life Gem isn't as mindless as other forms of regenerating health, since you need to carefully pick your moment to crush the gem and then gain the life back slowly, but it's a dramatic shift from the original. I am well aware that you can still skill your way through the game with only Estus. I can still do it today myself as I did it on my first playthrough, but fighting multiples was still frustrating in places, and remember that the game needs to be welcoming for those new to the series. That's why I think that fighting multiples in Dark Souls 1 is bad, but that it's okay in the sequel. Every minor hit you receive isn't a chip off the block that is your total potential healing before you have to go back to a bonfire. The game has also eased up on how equipment weighs you down, so it's easier to run around quickly and do these weaving tactics through more than one opponent. The fact that the game's frame rate is rock solid helps considerably, since all these quick moves with both character and the camera aren't bogged down. Where the game fails utterly, however, is in communicating this all to the player. The Souls series is known for letting you figure things out for yourself, but ignoring the lock-on system that has been a staple in games of this type since Ocarina of Time is so counterintuitive that I wouldn't be surprised if at least one person watching this right now has beaten Dark Souls 2 and hadn't even considered ignoring the lock-on. The extra healing items mean that players can brute force their way through multiple enemies instead, like the example I'm showing now. They stay locked on and either dodge or block and then attack when they can. They take a hit or two and then retreat to heal, and then repeat the whole thing all over again. Their healing resources have effectively become a number of how many times can I attack the enemy, and then they whittle them down slowly, painfully slowly. Or they use the exploits I spoke about earlier with doors and aggro boundaries, or cheesing with range weapons, or just ignoring multiples completely and running past them to the fog door. This also seeps into all other combat and encourages much sloppier play. I don't need to pay as much attention when fighting because I can take a few hits and then heal with a life gem afterward. You can get poisoned and not really care because it isn't going to eat up a limited Estus charge. Here's an easy way the game could have taught players to try fighting two enemies without locking on. Some sort of shadow type boss early in the game, maybe even the second boss to replace the Dragon Rider in Hyde's Tower that is immune to your lock on ability. After damaging it a bit, the boss would split into two and you would need to kill them both within 10 seconds of each other to successfully beat them. They could do minor damage with their attacks so it can stay firmly a learning experience. Neither can be locked on. There you go, now players have learned that lesson. Ideally, there would also be something that teaches you the importance of having a ranged ability, but hey, I already said that about 5 million times in the last video. I wish the Dark Souls 1 ran better so I can say for sure which game has the better combat, because having framerate higher than my age in Dark Souls 2 makes it so much better an experience that I genuinely cannot tell if it's just because of that, or if the looser combat with more enemies is more enjoyable. In theory, I prefer the gauntlets carefully balanced with the Estus Flask, but nothing makes me appreciate Dark Souls 2 more than going back to the first game. It feels like everything is moving underwater. The use of multiple enemies also extends to boss battles, and there are a few that do it poorly. The Duke's Deer Freya is a terrible encounter. You simply run from head to head, slashing once or twice and occasionally killing a spider. They have the potential to swarm you, but that's about it for the challenge in this fight. Other ones like Skeleton Lords and the Maw Rats before the gutter feel better, or at least they feel like a thematic fit for the monsters you're fighting. Whereas the Prowling Magus and Congregation feels like a room full of normal enemies that have been given a boss health bar for some weird reason. The bosses in this game are, generally speaking, weaker than the original, or at least they are when comparing the base game to each other. I think that was a good time to explain why I think that Dark Souls 2 is just as good as the original despite the changes that I've spoken about. If we strip away the DLC, I would say that the first half of Dark Souls 2 is close to perfect. Let's go with the standard scoring system that gaming websites use just for the sake of putting some numbers to it. We'll start with the first half here as a 9 out of 10. After acquiring the Lord Vessel, I think that the game drops down to a 6 out of 10 in its worst places, and then up to a 7 in the good. Think of Lost Izalith being the bad and Tomb of Giants being the good, but still nowhere near as good as the first half. The DLC brings the quality back up to a 9 out of 10, but it's quite short. Let's average this out to an 8 out of 10. Dark Souls 2 also starts out great. The Forest of Fallen Giants and Lost Bastille are arguably the best put together levels in the base game, but they're still not as good as the early bits in Dark Souls 1. However, the later levels never descend to the unfinished bullshit that is Lost Izalith and the craptacular mess bed of chaos that sits as a rotten cherry on a bowl of ice cream that was never frozen to begin with. I'd say the base game in Dark Souls 2 sits around 7 and maintains that level about evenly throughout the entire thing, so let's just leave it at that, 7 out of 10. So that's lower than the original, which I think most people would agree when comparing the base version of each game, but then both had substantial DLC added on. Here's where things get more interesting. The DLC in Dark Souls 2 is not only better than everything else in the game, but I consider it to be the absolute best part of the Souls series. Maybe Bloodborne is better, I haven't played it, but all three Crown of the X-King packs are so fantastic that they raise the whole game to equality with the original, or maybe even above it. They return to the layered levels, to reusing bonfires, to opening shortcuts and giving players new ways to interact with traps and enemies. They play with the idea of what defines a shortcut by giving you new ways to make a level easier. Almost all the bosses are fantastic, challenging, and feel like they were made by an entirely different team of people when compared to what was available in the base game. The DLC in the first Dark Souls was also great, but there's so much more of it in Dark Souls 2. It also costs more, so that might be a factor for you to consider. I also didn't think they would ever top the dragon fight against Calamite, but the battle against Sin is so great that I think they outdid themselves. The next video in this series will be looking at level design in Dark Souls 2 and making some comparisons to the first game. The third video will be on that DLC. So if you're a fan of the series that didn't bother playing it for whatever reason, I urge you to give it a chance. At the very least, I strongly recommend that you do not watch the third video in this series before playing it yourself. That's all for this one. Thank you very much for watching. The next video should be out next week. In the interest of transparency, I'm hoping that smaller, somewhat self-contained videos like these will be easier to digest by viewers who are turned off by anything over an hour long. I know that I would be skeptical myself looking at something like that from a new YouTuber. If you liked this video, please subscribe to be notified when more come out. If you loved it, however, then you might want to consider supporting me on Patreon, whether as a tip or to show that you'd like to see more videos like this. I would ask that anyone who does want to give something to keep the number low. I think the best case scenario with something like this would be a lot of people committing to $1 or $2 rather than a handful going big with it. Either way, thank you again for watching. Hopefully you'll join me next time.